Thank you everyone for coming out tonight and sharing Ortiz. I'm chair of the Religion Department. Welcome to the Hope College Religion Department's annual Danforth Lecture. Danforth Lecture at Hope College is now in its 32nd year, and as you can see on the back of your program, those of you who were lucky enough, the first 1,000 entrants got a program. You can see in your program, it has a very long tradition of superb and well-renowned scholars. Tonight's lecture by Dr. Anderson will continue this tradition of excellence. Gary Anderson is the Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Theology, Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame. His area of specialization is the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, with a special focus on its early Jewish and Christian reception. He is the author of 7 books, editor of 7 more, and the author of about 80 articles. Some of his books include Sin, a history, a personal history? No. It's a different book. Sin, a history, followed by Charity, the place of the poor in the biblical tradition, and most recently, That I Might Dwell Among Them, Incarnation and Atonement in the Tabernacle Narrative. So personally benefited very much from Dr. Anderson's work, particularly from his book on charity, which actually is on my bedside table. I'm reading it in the evenings. It's been illuminating my study of monasticism. But also, especially, his really wonderful book called Christian Doctrine in the Old Testament, Theology in the Service of Biblical Exegesis. It's really just a majestic volume, brings together really nuanced critical exegesis with really sound theology, which is a very rare combo for those of you in the field, and just really enhances our understanding of both Bible theology. And my Religion 100 students know that we read this, we read a section of that last week. Tonight, Dr. Anderson will speak on the forgiveness of King David. Please help me welcome Gary.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be here at Hope College. I grew up in Michigan myself, in the Detroit area. I worked for one of the automotive companies. And my sister-in-law went to Hope. I've got lots of affiliation with Hope through the years, and it's a pleasure to be here as a visitor for the first time. There was a handout. I don't know if there was enough of them. It doesn't matter. It's not absolutely crucial. But the handout will help those who have it in front of them follow my way through a couple of biblical texts. I'd like to begin in an unusual way with an episode from the award-winning TV series, The Crown. The series concerns Queen Elizabeth and follows her life through the many decades she served as queen. My focus will be on an episode in season 2 called Vergangenheit, a German word meaning the past. In this episode, we see the intrigue that surrounds the Duke of Windsor's actions during the Second World War, woven into the story of Billy Graham's first gospel crusade in the British Isles. Let me begin by making an important aside. I'm not interested in historical accuracy with respect to this episode, but rather the theological logic embedded within the script. It turns out that the Queen loved Billy Graham and saw him twice during his visit. At the end of the episode, we learn the reason for the juxtaposition of these two themes. The Queen has a very difficult task in front of her. The Duke of Windsor, who had abdicated from the throne a few decades earlier due to an irregular marriage and had been forced into exile in Paris, is now seeking to return to Britain. He believes he served his time. Now is the time for forgiveness. Punishment should not go on in perpetuity. But unbeknownst to him, the archives related to his actions during the war are about to be released to the public. The Queen has learned about them for the first time. It so happens that the Duke had been a collaborator with Hitler and the Nazis at the beginning of the war. It seemed he had hoped to use the influence of the German military machine to assist him in his return to the throne. And that was only one of the horrors that the queen had come to learn. Against this background, the queen had to reshuffle her cards, so to speak, and think again about the task in front of her. Could she forgive the Duke? She invites Billy Graham to her home to give her counsel. I've included in the handout a transcript of that conversation. Queen Elizabeth asks, "Are there any circumstances where one can be a good Christian and not forgive?" Graham, Christian teaching is very clear on this. No one is beneath forgiveness. Dying on the cross, Jesus himself asked the Lord to forgive those that killed him. Elizabeth, yes, but we must remember his words. They know not what they do. That forgiveness was conditional. True, Graham says, but he still forgave. God himself forgives us all. Who are we to reject the example of God? Mere mortals? Graham, we are all mortals. That is our fate. But we need not be unchristian ones. Here, Graham, presented as a very sensitive pastor, you can see Elizabeth isn't following him on this line of thought. He changes course slightly. The solution, he says, for being unable to forgive, one asks for forgiveness oneself, humbly and sincerely, and one prays for those that one cannot forgive. And then the camera cuts to the chapel. Looking down the length of the aisle, we see Elizabeth kneeling in prayer before the altar. So the end result is that Billy Graham urges the Queen to offer forgiveness, but as the episode unfolds, the Queen will eventually stay her ground and refuse to do so. The way in which the script is written, I think most of us would be inclined to stand with the Queen rather than the preacher. But precisely for this reason, I would suggest that something has gone awry. Why is it so natural that we as viewers of the episode would stand athwart what the gospel seems to demand? The answer, I'd like to suggest this evening, is that the scriptwriters presume a definition of forgiveness that doesn't quite square with the Bible. Now, to be fair, the deviance here is not catastrophic. The scene that ends with the Queen on her knees, praying for herself and her adversary, is most commendable. But the Queen's deep conviction that she's failed as a disciple of Christ cannot be right. In order to get a proper grasp on the theological dimensions of the challenge she faces, we'll have to look more closely at how the process of forgiveness works in a central passage from the church's Bible. We'll begin here in 1 Samuel with Saul before turning to David. This is the first text on your handout, and I see it's on page 2. I didn't number these too well. We'll end up on page, I guess the first will be last and the last will be first. We'll embody the gospel in the handout in any event. There are two crucial dimensions of forgiveness that are not treated adequately. First is the necessity of contrition. We see this illustrated in the way in which Saul and David react to the remonstrations they receive from their respective prophets, Samuel vis-a-vis Saul and Nathan with respect to David. Let's begin with Saul and Samuel. Before looking at your handout, it's important to note that our narrator has given us at least 3 crucial pieces of information. Firstly, at the beginning of the chapter, Saul receives a clear command from God. Secondly, the narrator clearly tells us that Saul has not carried out this command fully. And then thirdly, most importantly, this is often missed by readers, Samuel wrestles with the Lord over what should be done in light of the disobedience that Saul has displayed. In my opinion, this wrestling scene recalls the actions of Moses when he tries to persuade God to move from punishment to mercy after the sin of the golden calf. What we need to draw from this parallel is that Samuel and God are clearly discussing how to handle Saul's disobedience, and as of that moment, a decision has not yet been reached. So that what follows, there's an enormous amount of tension built up with the reader. What is going to be the determination? And how will that determination be made? Everything we're going to see is going to depend on how Saul conducts himself in the subsequent conversation, which I've reproduced on your handout. In brief, the question will be, will Saul show contrition or will he not? When Saul appears before Samuel, his first words are, 1a in your handout, "May you be blessed by the Lord. I've carried out the command of the Lord." Now, we as readers know, as well as Samuel, that this isn't true. But it's important to note that Samuel does not point this out. He strikes a pose of naivete and then asks what appears to be an innocent question. 1b, what then is this bleating of sheep and lowing of cattle that I hear? Those animals were supposed to be prescribed and not taken. Clearly the terms of the command has not been followed. And now the real question for us as readers, will Saul, now that he's been found out, offer a confession? Unfortunately, he does not. Believing that Samuel doesn't know the full story, Saul continues to misstate the facts, this time attributing whatever blame there might be to his soldiers. So text 2a, Saul said, "They," that is the soldiers, "have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people," and not Saul, "spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest," now finally Saul includes himself, "we have utterly destroyed." He's obedient, the people are not. Samuel is not happy with this disingenuousness. Putting aside his posture of ignorance, now Samuel gets right to the point. 2b, "Stop! I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not head of the tribes of Israel?" That is what they do is your responsibility. "The Lord anointed you king over Israel. The Lord sent you on a mission. Go, utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord?" Shockingly, however, Saul continues with his self-justification. Still, no expression of guilt. 3a, "I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me. I have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But from the spoil, the people again took sheep and cattle, the best of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal." At this point, Samuel's patience is at an end. If there had been a chance to moderate the penalty for his wrongdoing, that moment has now long passed. And Samuel turns to Saul and announces the verdict. 3b, Samuel said, "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." This, however, is not the end of the story. Samuel also notes that God has found another person, David, to replace Saul as king. But as we learn over the next 11 chapters, Saul also refuses to accept this decree. For the remainder of his days, he will persecute David, and as a result, fail to be the beneficiary of David's martial prowess in his fight against the Philistines. Now let's turn to David's encounter with Nathan. Turning that handout over to page 1. If we turn to 2 Samuel 12, we'll see a very different sort of response from King David when he's confronted by the prophet Nathan after his dalliance with Bathsheba. After the prophet tells his story about the rich man taking a poor man's lamb to feed a guest, David immediately condemns the rich man. Nathan then swiftly turns on his heel and applies this parable to David. "You are the man." Verse 7 there in the handout. To which David then responds, we have to go down to verse 13, "I have sinned against the Lord." The alacrity here that David displays in his expression of contrition is rewarded by the prophet. No sooner has David confessed than David pronounces that the capital penalty that should have been ensued has now been rescinded. Reading on in the text, verse 13, the Lord has put away your sin, you shall not die. If we turn back to the episode from The Crown, we'll discover that when the Duke is confronted by the Queen about his relationship to Hitler and the Nazis in the early days of the Second World War, his response conforms almost exactly to that of Saul rather than David. The Duke, like Saul, has no idea how much the Queen knows, and so in the conversation dramatically understates the culpability of his actions. Clearly, the Duke does not enjoy that form of grace which leads to a humble and sincere confession. But this is not the only part of the episode that doesn't do justice to the Bible. Indeed, a far bigger problem is to be found. The writers of this episode labor under the presupposition that forgiveness is a simple matter of clearing the books, putting all parties concerned back into the position of the status quo ante. They possess, we might want to say, you know this theological vocabulary, a forensic understanding of the atonement, in which an act of grace expunges without remainder every remnant of a perpetrated crime. The logic of the episode presumes that forgiveness requires the Duke's return to England. But in the story of David's penitential discipline, things do not play out so simply. Let's return to our text. You may have noticed that when I cited Nathan's condemnation of David in verse 7, and then we went to David's response in verse 13, I skipped over an enormous amount of text. In these verses, Nathan documents some of the events that are going to befall David as a result of his wrongdoing. Let's take a look at them, beginning in verse 10. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. It's kind of measure for measure punishment. You put Uriah to the sword will not depart from your house. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house. The second part of the sin, of course, was adultery with Bathsheba. That also will be subject now to measure for measure punishment. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun. Your humiliation will be complete. Chief among the events that are to follow, of course, later in the story, is the coup d'etat that David's son Absalom will initiate. The sword shall never depart. And in a couple of chapters, we learn that that coup d'etat, of that coup d'etat, and its consequences. Here in your handout, the second text there on page 1, beginning in chapter 15, verse 13. A messenger came to David saying, the hearts of the Israelites have gone after Absalom. And David said to all of his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, get up, let's flee, or there will be no escape for us from Absalom. We'll be put to death. Hurry, or he will soon overtake us and bring disaster upon us and attack the city with the edge of the sword. Unlike Saul, David doesn't reject the penalty that the prophet proposed. Quite the contrary. Here's the important point. David humbly submits to what he believes is his due. By accepting the terms of his punishment, David not only deepens his contrition, but he also, quite ironically, prepares the way for his own return to the throne. The punishments in this story become a means of spiritual transformation rather than simply balancing the scales of a primitive form of karmic justice. The key episode here is found in chapter 15, verses 24 to 29, also on your handout. David's allies in Jerusalem, in a bid to help him secure a victory against his son, take the ark out of the city so that it can accompany David and offer, presumably, its considerable aid in securing his return to the throne. But David will have none of this. Rather, he puts his future as Israel's king wholly in the hands of God. And this would be something he should do even if he wasn't punished, right? So the punishment is becoming the means of transformation. It's moving from punishment to something else. Reading here in verse 24, Abiathar came up, and Zadok also with all the Levites, carrying the ark of the covenant of God. They set down the ark of God until the people had all passed out of the city. Then the king said to Zadok, "Carry the ark of God back into the city." Here are the key lines. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, it's not clear that he will. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and the place where it dwells. But if God says, "I take no pleasure in you," well, what's David's response? "Here I am. Let him do to me what seems good to him." So Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they remained there. Not surprisingly, some commentators have drawn comparison here to Christ as he makes his way out of the city of Jerusalem on Holy Thursday. David's following the path that Jesus himself would follow. Like David, he knew his life and kingship was in danger, and this was the source of considerable consternation. In Mark's Gospel, we read that when Jesus had repaired to the Garden of Gethsemane, roughly where David is, he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray. I'm deeply grieved even to death. Remain here and keep awake." Going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, that this hour might pass from him. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me." And then lines that certainly recall David, "Yet not what I want, but what you want." Yet against all odds, both Christ and David put everything in the hands of their Heavenly Father. Christ is an act of his true, faithful, obedient sonship. David as a penitent sinner, but again, the punishment is no longer punishment, right? It's an act of self-transformation. This act of self-renunciation becomes, in the grace-filled logic of the Bible, the best way of advancing the kingdom. But I'd rather not dwell this evening on the Christological dimension. More important for my immediate purposes is the scriptural principle here, very important to remember, especially in viewing the crown, that forgiveness does not result in an immediate return to the status quo ante. Forgiveness is a process in which the corruption found in one's soul has to be expunged and over time set in proper order. The benefit of comparing David to Christ is that we see the punishment of David becoming the path to his Christomorphic transformation. Let's pause and ponder this last point a little longer. What I'm suggesting here is that there's a sort of alchemical transformation taking place. True, David is paying the price for his transgression. The strict terms of justice are certainly being applied, but at one and the same time, David is being conformed to the cruciform shape of Christ's life. What had threatened to be mere punishment, which of course, that's what Saul experiences, has now become what St. Thomas Aquinas would call an act of making satisfaction. I'll return in a moment to explain in more detail what St. Thomas was meant by such a phrase. If we turn back, actually, I am turning back. If we turn back to our episode from the crown, we'll notice that the queen labors under a significant misconception about the nature of forgiveness. She felt called by the gospel to forgive the duke, but could not fulfill that obligation because she assumed that forgiveness would require allowing the duke to return to England and live his life as he had prior to his banishment. But the duke's sin, of course, was very grave, certainly on the par with that of David, and the notion that certain consequences might be fixed in stone would certainly seem reasonable. We could compare similar grave sins in the lives of ordinary individuals. For example, consider a woman who endured considerable physical abuse from her husband over several years. A formal separation and a restraining order from the courts would certainly be in order. But if years down the line the offending husband showed contrition and wished to return, I think all of us would agree that the former wife would be well within her rights to refuse such a proposal. She could forgive him in her heart. Think of the remarkable words of Erica Kirk a few weeks ago. But that would by no means necessitate a return to the status quo ante. The offending husband, for his part, would repeat, with just slight modification, the words of David. He could say, if she says, I take no pleasure in you, then here I am, O God. May she do what seems good to her. At this point, I'd like to take a step back for a second and reconsider our comparison of David and Saul. As we noted, David and Saul responded to the rebukes they received from their prophets in diametrically opposite ways. Saul tried to mislead Samuel about the nature of his transgression and only offered a confession when he was pushed into the corner. And even then, Saul continued to hedge and appeal for a means to save face. David, on the other hand, quickly confesses his guilt, accepts not only responsibility for the sin in question, but accepts all the punishments that were to follow from his actions. One of the defining features of the tragic nature of Saul's plight was his refusal to accept the verdict of the prophet. He was told in no uncertain terms that he would be denied the principle of dynastic succession, and he'd be quickly replaced by a man of the Lord's own choosing. But the rest of his life, Saul contested the terms of the punishment and did everything he could to thwart David's rise to the throne. The contrast between the two men could not be more complete and well-defined. As I perused the theological literature in an attempt to come up with a vocabulary that could encompass this difference, I could find none better than that of Thomas Aquinas. In his Summa, he uses the incident, actually this very incident, of David's repentance to argue that the effects of one's sinful actions linger beyond the point of hearing the words of absolution from a priest. But more importantly, for our immediate purposes, he distinguishes the meting out of punishment to satisfy the requirements of justice from merciful acts of satisfaction, which not only satisfy justice, but far more importantly, repair the state of the soul injured by sin. Rather than considering Thomas directly, I've chosen a scholar of Thomas, Rick van Neuwenhoven, to articulate this difference. He writes as follows. There are, Aquinas states, two significant differences between punishment and satisfaction. First, the person who makes satisfaction to God freely submits himself to penance so as to renounce sin in his will. Think David submitting to Nathan's penance that he puts before David. Therefore, whether actions are actually punishments or satisfactions depends on the attitude of the person who is subject to them. Saul refuses, David accepts. If we accept afflictions about which we ourselves can do nothing, they lose their penal character and acquire instead a satisfactory or purifying character. That's the alchemical transformation. This illustrates that poene are not inflicted by God for their own sake, as if God delighted in them, but for something else, namely redirecting creatures to their proper and genuine goal. Now, I realize that this particular theological distinction between punishment and satisfaction is probably not native to the Reformed tradition. It's not my wish this evening to impose a foreign theological vocabulary on you. I think that for both Catholic and Reformed Christians, the scriptural witness should be our primary concern. And whatever sort of vocabulary we end up adopting, I think it's fair to say that it should be able to make sense of the way in which both Saul and David respond to the prophetic rebukes they receive, and how the punishments that are imposed on both of them unfold in such dramatically different ways. Though I'm comfortable with the language of St. Thomas, I would readily concede that it's not the only way to proceed. Let me end with one more text I think pulls together the threads of my lecture. This text comes from the recent Catechism of the Catholic Church. I picked this text because I think it captures quite well what's going on in the story of David, but I also think it addresses in an ecumenically sensitive fashion what is certainly a worry that many Protestants would carry about the implications of the doctrine of satisfaction. Reading here from paragraph 1459 about sin. Many sins wrong our neighbor, and one must do what is possible in order to repair that harm. Return stolen goods, restore the reputation of someone that we've slandered, pay compensation for injuries. In other words, it's not enough simply to go to a priest and say, I'm sorry, if you've done things that can be visibly corrected and repaired. It's incumbent upon you to do that. Simple justice requires as much. But sin also injures and weakens the sinner himself. Here's the key point. As well as the relationship of the sinner with God and neighbor. Absolution, the words of forgiveness that a priest or God might say, takes away sin, but it doesn't remedy all the disorders that sin has caused. Raised up from sin, receiving words of forgiveness, the sinner must still recover his full spiritual health by doing something more to make amends for the sin. He must, in the words of the Catechism, make satisfaction for his sins, which I'm suggesting is what David did. Now, this last sentence may indeed raise eyebrows. In the 16th century, there were brave words that Catholic thinking about forgiveness added a very dangerous element of human agency into the question. The German term for this was Selbsterlösung, the act of saving one's soul by one's own good works. An idea that clearly contradicted the Pauline premise that we're saved from perdition by grace alone, sola gratia, and not by the works of the law. But in the immediately following paragraph, the Catechism, I think, addresses this worry by making a very important qualification as to what it means for a penitent sinner to, quote, make satisfaction for his sins. Continuing here with the Catechism. The satisfaction that we make for our sins is not so much ours, as though it were not done through Jesus Christ. We who can do nothing ourselves, as if just by ourselves, can do all things with the cooperation of Him who strengthens us. Thus man has nothing of which to boast, but all our boasting is in Christ, in whom we make satisfaction by bringing forth fruits that befit repentance. These fruits have their efficacy from Him. By Him they are offered to the Father, and through Him they are accepted by the Father. Now, I'm not sure whether this would satisfy a truly determined Lutheran, for whom any sense of human agency often recalls the heresy of Pelagius, but in the Reformed tradition, given its strong interest in the process of sanctification, that is, the idea that the believer can grow in grace, that tradition has always shared a great openness to human cooperation with the power of the Holy Spirit. The Orthodox to the East, of course, share this concern and refer to such growth in grace as the process of deification. But my purpose this evening, again, is not to persuade you to adopt a theological vocabulary that's Catholic. My only request is that we look together at the story of the forgiveness and repair of David's soul and try to fashion a theology of forgiveness that can do justice to what we see in these biblical words. My focus this evening, some concluding thoughts here, has been on the story of David's sin in the books of Samuel, or more specifically, the way in which each man responded, that is Saul and David, to the prophetic rebukes that they received. The process of forgiveness that was outlined included three elements: the grace of contrition, which is truly a grace given by God, the courage of a good confession, and the discipline undertaken of spiritual repair. In Saul and David, we see how these three factors unfold. When Samuel approaches Saul, he does not immediately reveal that he knows the extent of Saul's disobedience. He wants to create a space for Saul, so that Saul can be, if moved by a contrite heart, offer a full and unforced confession. Things might have unfolded very differently had Saul been granted such a grace. But Saul fails at this task, and when a subsequent penalty is imposed, Saul fights it with every fiber in his body. Justice is served. Saul, unfortunately, is utterly humiliated. David's response could not be more contrasted. Faced with his crime and its consequences, he makes a full and sincere confession, but he must undergo the penalties that his actions justly deserve. To his credit, David assumes them willingly and refuses the aid of the art to lessen in any way the alienation he has come to experience from his God. As a result, justice is also served. But unlike Saul, David's punishment is not ordered to his humiliation, but eventually to his exaltation. By accepting his potentially permanent exile, David ironically secures his restoration to the throne. To gain his life, he had to lose it. And so we see in the books of Samuel a fine example I have tried to suggest of what St. Thomas said was the distinction between suffering a punishment and making satisfaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for that really stimulating, wide-ranging lecture. We have time for Q&A. So raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll scurry over with the mic. Do try to keep them relatively brief and make sure that they're questions.
Hi, thank you so much for that lecture. That's super interesting. I'm curious, you're talking about the gospel implications of both the stories. How do you think the almost parabolic structure works with Nathan's confrontation of David in making it into a more gospel-esque story? The fact that he uses an almost parable, or you can even argue it as a parable, to confront him, whereas Samuel uses a different method of confrontation.
So I guess, if I've understood your question right, I guess I would rephrase it if I was in answering it. I think it might be better to say, you said, why does our author use a gospel-esque formulation? You might want to better say, why does Jesus use an Old Testament formulation in order to teach what he teaches? So parables are very much a part of the prophets of the Old Testament that Jesus adopts. And then, the punishment that, David undergoes is simply the gospel lived in the Old Testament. The French would say, avant la lettre, before the law. The gospel is an eternal truth. It's realized by the saints of the Old Testament. And that's what we see there. And that's what I meant to say by that example. So, John Calvin, and one of my favorite scholars, Reverend Childs, like to say that both the Old and the New Testament preach Christ, but both in their own way. And that's what I think, I hope I've shown this evening.
Hello. I really liked your talk today. Thank you so much.
Hi.
So I had a question about So you gave a really great point around this, the television show Queen Elizabeth, and you said, essentially, if I could put words in your mouth, she suffered from sort of a simplistic version of forgiveness. So my question is, why? And why is there this? Because I heard this a lot growing up. It's like, oh, this person wronged me, but I forgave them. And that's kind of the end of the story. And where does this flat version of forgiveness come from? Because it's something I, by the way, don't see in history. Something was coming to mind when I was trying to formulate this question, which is the persecution of Decius in 250, right? So there's this giant persecution that happens to the early church. Everybody who's a Christian, everybody in the empire is required to make a sacrifice to a pagan god. And Christians respond in three different ways. A bunch of them make the sacrifice to the pagan god. A bunch of them flee and leave the country. A bunch of them get executed and martyred. And then, I don't know, 30 years later or whatever, they all finally have a chance to come back, and then there's this confusion about what to do. What do we do with these people who sacrificed to the idols, and then there's these people who ran away, or they fled, they had to leave their homes, or anything like that. Everyone's just cool, we're all just going to come together. And they realize that John 20:23 clearly says that sometimes you're supposed to withhold forgiveness. And that's, if I understand this correctly, the persecution of Decius is the people who sacrificed to idols had to go through a process, which is to your point of saying that, listen, there's a process involved in this. And so I would be interested to hear, do you think that the reason why Elizabeth, in your example, has a simplistic view of forgiveness, including in general the kind of popular conceptions today, including in the CRC where I grew up, why is there this flat, simple, overly simple view of forgiveness? It's because there hasn't it's left behind this idea that actually sometimes forgiveness should not be given, not in the sense of whatever they've done something, an axe murderer, they don't have to forgive him, but the person who cheats on the test do, but in the sense that in the persecution of Decius, a certain amount of restitution and process should be gone through before there is this. So there's this idea that it's actually really important to withhold forgiveness, which I don't see in any of the Protestant churches today, but I do see it in the history of the Catholic Church. So I'm just, sorry, my question's a little long, but I'm interested to hear, do you think that Elizabeth suffers from this problem because of her overly Protestant, it's all cool, man, kind of thing that she's doing?
So I'm certainly not going to use this opportunity to launch into Catholic apologetics at the cost of Protestants. That would be most unseemly, and not first of all, I don't believe it, but I'm not going to do that. So, but your question is a very good one. I would want to say a couple of things. Working on a book on the subject of sin and forgiveness, and certainly one of the themes of the book is that the Bible has many different depictions of sin and forgiveness, and they all can't be boiled down to a set of easy bullet points. Every situation, you might want to say, has its own unique configuration that has to be respected. I think this story is like an ideal type, a kind of Weberian ideal type that's been received in the church that way. It is a kind of model. We have to be careful not to take it as a model and woodenly make every incident follow it. So that would be the first thing I would say. But I think, forgiveness also occurs as a kind of multi-planar reality. So if you think of, Pope John Paul II, for example, forgiving his assassin who shot him with a bullet, or, Erica Kirk recently. I think for a human being to forgive directly an assailant, that had caused harm for them, is doing at least two things. It's expressing that they're not going to harbor feelings of vengeance, anger, and retribution toward that person. But I think it also has a kind of evangelical message. In other words, God forgives us while we were yet sinners. That forgiveness is going to, the offer of forgiveness precedes any action on the part of forgiveness, right? Going back to that notion, again, Protestant notion, but I think also a Catholic notion, that we're saved sola gratia. But we shouldn't confuse, I can't interview Erica Kirk, but I think certain John Paul II would say that his forgiving his assailant means that the assailant in turn is forgiven by God, and that's the end of the story. I don't think we're to draw that equation at all. I'm sure that John Paul II, that was responsible for the catechism that I was reading from, could have referred to those pages and would want to say that this is a Turkish man, I believe, to be fully forgiven in the eyes of God, will have to be contrite, confess, and undergo whatever process of repair for the soul that is demanded. I think the problem in this show, now where does it ultimately come from? I mean, I wouldn't want to enter into a kind of genealogy of that, but I do think, what the Queen actually thought when she was confronting this, we don't know. We're addressing the scriptwriters, so the question is, what ideas are the scriptwriters laboring under? And I think they do have a very naive sense that forgiveness means returning to the status quo ante. If the Queen's going to forgive the Duke, he has to be brought back into the British Isles and everything is forgotten. And that's why I say we certainly side with the Queen, because what the Duke has done is probably removed himself from British culture forever. He simply has to realize that. But this problem appears in many different avenues. We have it in reconciliation groups, for example, in South Africa. Worries, especially NGOs, about justice, forgiveness erodes the outworking of justice. This notion that somehow if we forgive, there's no consequences. This has manifold implications in popular culture that of course just a short lecture like this I can't do. So I think that the reason I love the TV series is I think it's like the tip of an iceberg revealing enormous popular conception of forgiveness that can in the end do great harm. So I would agree with you, but I don't think that there's any reason why. There's not a reason why I think a Protestant could find a way in which to work this Davidic sequence into their own theology of forgiveness. What I did tonight, I used the native vocabulary that I use. I think is good for identifying what these themes are. But I wouldn't want to boil down my comments certainly to a Catholic Protestant position. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you for your talk. I'm thinking about the distinction between atonement and making satisfaction, as you put it, and kind of wondering what would you say about God's role and human's role, or lack thereof, and the difference between those two words that are associated with forgiveness?
So, if we're thinking of atonement, certainly Christ's atoning act on the cross puts in the possibility of everybody being forgiven. But I think to actualize that forgiveness requires some agency on the part of the person, contrition, confession, and then being molded into the form and person of Jesus Christ. We can use the term satisfaction, which is a Catholic vocabulary, deification, as it were, if we use the language of the Eastern Church, or sanctification is probably the closest correlate we can find in the Reformed tradition. I grew up United Methodist. John Wesley would say going on to perfection. But I think there's lots of vocabulary we can use to encompass this. But I do think, at least in my mind, one view of the atonement I think that won't work with this story of David, certainly won't work with the crown, is what I call the kind of forensic notion of atonement, where God is some kind of judge, simply says not guilty, and that's the end of the story. If that's what the atonement is, then it doesn't make sense to what happens in the Old Testament, where I kind of nascent Marcionism at stake. So that notion of the atonement, it seems to me, simply doesn't do justice to what happens when individuals are forgiven. But when David's forgiven, when anyone's forgiven, this is, at least in my mind, the actualization of the fruits of the divine gift. Gift of love of the Father and the Son to the world, and I don't see any problem with correlating the two.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anderson.
Oh, Mr. Billings. Aaron, you missed Castaneda.
Yep.
She was her former name as I knew her.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you. Good to see you.
See you.
I thought I'd start with if you want, a venerable Protestant example making a similar point that would also address whether this is a Protestant concern. about forgiveness and whether you no longer have consequences, I was reminded of the line in "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" by the Coen Brothers. When when theologian number one, Delmar, says, after getting baptized, the preacher says, "My sins is washed away, including the Piggly Wiggly I knocked over in Yazoo." And then Ulysses says, "That's not the issue, Delmar. The state of Mississippi is a little bit more hard-nosed." So on the one hand, there's this sense of, definitely a sense of forgiveness doesn't mean that there's no consequences, speaking on a horizontal level. But I'm also wondering whether we need more tools in our toolbox for scriptural interpretation of this. And especially with what you were just saying, I also want to avoid a Marcionite view of the Bible, absolutely. But if you don't have a forensic account as a possibility, I just wonder in the New Testament if you're missing some important things. So, for example, I was on a dissertation committee that was comparing Aquinas' Romans commentary with Calvin, and when Aquinas comes to Romans 8:1, that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ, and a sense of assurance of God's pardon, Aquinas infers that that is a special revelation that applied only to St. Paul, not to the readers, not to us, because that's too forensic of the notion. And since we're speaking about David, which is in a particular office, and Jesus is the anointed one, is in this office, which you beautifully, pointed to with Gethsemane and so forth. He takes up the consequences of our sin in this way. Isn't that still compatible with a forensic account of divine human forgiveness, even if it's not necessarily with human-to-human forgiveness? So the state of Mississippi can and should keep its laws in terms of consequences. But if we belong to the Messiah, the ones who has done things on our behalf that we could never do, isn't a forensic account at least something you could have in our next toolbox?
I guess if we go that route, then the important move made, I think, in the story of David, of the punishments being transformed to actions that transform David disappear. And at least in my opinion, that element of the human spiritual life, psychological life, an element of human existence that both defines the human being before Christ and after Christ. So if we do go, and there may be ways of shading forensic notions of atonement that will solve my worries. But my worry when I mention such a conception is that Christ, as it were, as a judge, he says not guilty, and then there are no consequences. So the husband who's violated his wife, he's forgiven, he can return. And if the wife doesn't allow him to return, that's her problem. I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that. And the theology that takes us in that direction, I think, should be reconsidered. And the same with the Duke of Windsor, and the same with David. It's not a matter, the point I'm trying to make is it's not a matter of God being conformed to some karmic principle of justice that he has to meet out, right? The punishments that are imposed are punishments that are, meant to be corrected, punishments that repair. And if we understand it that way, then I think it's wholly in accord with what the gospel demands, and even more fundamentally, it's wholly in accord with how we are made as persons.
Hi, Dr. Anderson. Thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
One thing that really stood out is when you talked about David's sort of punishment that becomes satisfaction, it's ordered to his exaltation rather than his humiliation.
Right.
And so, comparing the forensic system of forgiveness and this sort of system around satisfaction, would you say, how would you compare the exaltation that David's satisfaction leads him to? Is a similar exaltation possible in a more forensic view? Is David better off with the satisfaction of his sins than if he would have been, say he didn't sin in the first place? He's gotten greater good out of the evil, or how would that view of exaltation be compared between the two things?
All right, I'd rather let's just stick with the story and not focus on the technical terminology driving systematic theology. Also wrote a sola scriptura position here. So, with respect to your question, how is the humiliation ordered to exaltation? Well, what I tried to say, we couldn't, of course, look at everything in the course of our lecture, but as a result of David, in essence, giving up on his kingship. If you will it, God, let it happen. If not, I'm happy to remain in exile, is actually the turning point for bringing David back to the throne. So it does become his exaltation. If I had more time, we could compare this to the contrition of Judah in Genesis chapter 44, which does the same kind of alchemical work, where Judah is, in essence, the worst of the sons of Jacob in terms of his role in attempting to murder his brother Joseph. But he's the one, who offers contrition at the end that turns the whole story around. And any reader of that story knows that Judah is simply David in waiting. And that by this display of contrition, he has ironically shown his fittingness to become king of all Israel. One example, I think I gave this a bunch, I can't remember, I've seen a few people today, but there's a kind of irony you might want to say in the life of penitence, which is reflected in this statement of the Talmud, that those who undergo penance are closer to God's heart than the righteous. A kind of shocking statement. The Talmud actually disputes that as well, but the very fact that it can propose it is very interesting. How do we understand that? Well, this is how I understand it. I can't claim that this is necessarily the Talmud, but this is how I was rendering it. The difference, and I use here an example of Eric Clapton. I love this video on YouTube. Recommend it. I'm sure all the undergraduates know what YouTube is. Definitely, Eric Clapton, Holy Mother. Look, that is incredible. It's about Eric Clapton's prayer in the moments of despair over horrendous drug abuse and alcoholism. He's like rock bottom. And the video is him, Havarati, and this African choir in London. Incredible song. But displaying, contrition, in its finest form. Why would Eric Clapton in that position be more beloved in the eyes of God than Professor Gary Anderson, the Hesburgh professor of Catholic theology at the University of Notre Dame? This is why. Because there's a very thin line between being righteous and being self-righteous. And what the abject sinner knows, Eric Clapton, when he's puking in his hotel room after nearly ODing on heroin, is he knows his only hope is in God. He can do nothing. I can say that notionally, but I can't feel that from my hair to my toenails, right? That's not a pretty good talk. I don't do drugs, I don't steal stuff, but all those things I say are actually, as I say that stuff, I inch closer and closer to self-righteousness, right? can't remember what question this was meant to answer. I feel like I'm a preacher. The point is, no, humiliation leads to exaltation. That's right. So that's David too. So I think one of the, he's this horrendous sinner, but he also knows the gravity of what he's done. And he knows the task before him to correct that. It's also where I think at least too superficial of a forensic notion of atonement doesn't work. David is this abject sinner. He has to be repaired. His repair is not a human work, right? Remember what I read from the Catechism? It's Christ doing this through him. He knows he can't do it, right? He knows he can't. That's why he's praying. That's why it's Holy Mother. Everything depends on his Holy Mother appealing to her Son to give him the power to overcome what he can't do. Right? His humiliation now, his confession of it actually is the spot of transformation. I think that's what David's experience is as well. Why I think this story becomes the model psalm of penitence in Psalm 51, at least in the Catholic tradition, the psalm that's read every Friday morning. The day of Christ's crucifixion. It's the way in which the individual believer puts himself in the position of the abject sinner, like David, appealing for the grace of God, to not be righteous, leaning into self-righteousness, but to be like Eric Clapton, lying on the carpet in your living room, realizing that without the grace of God, you are utterly, nothing. So you can picture sin, the gravity of sin, both in terms of its depth, what David is, or in its frequency. Christ said, forgive, 70 times 7. These are two sides of the same coin. In other words, nothing falls outside the boundary of what God can forgive, right? Not David's heinous acts, not people who repeat acts ad infinitum. God can forgive anything, but the forgiveness requires, again, contrition, confession, and acceptance of one's penance, one's rite or ritual of repair.
Okay, great. Two more.
I'm wondering a bit about I'm wondering about Bathsheba's role in all of this. You refer to their relationship as a dalliance, and then you call it adultery, which again is pretty typical, but she didn't consent to any of this. At least there's no evidence of her consenting, and so I think you could call it a rape and not a dalliance, and certainly not adultery. And so if that were the case, he never seems to confess to her. He doesn't apologize to her. He says he sinned against God. But to what degree does he sin against her? And if that's the case, does that change the nature of his repentance and of God's forgiveness?
Good. That's a great question. I think, personally, I would not argue this is rape, so you're certainly correct. There's no indication that Bathsheba is willing. I don't think the story is, it's like the role of Isaac in Genesis 22, and subsequent to biblical exegesis, Isaac will be raised to the principal figure in that story. But in Genesis, he's really just, he's just, for lack of a better term, a pawn that's necessary for the trial that Abraham undergoes. In fact, throughout the book of Genesis, Isaac is distinguished by having no agency. And I think also in this episode, Bathsheba will be depicted as having agency later in the David cycle, but in this particular story, I don't think our biblical author is interested in that. Our biblical author does, I didn't bring my Bible here with me, but the biblical author does indicate at the end of the story that there seems to be some form of, I don't want to say reconciliation, but at least some sort of moderation of whatever happened, because they're referred to as husband and wife. The names are mentioned, and David comforts Bathsheba by having sexual relations with her again to father a child that will become Solomon. So that means. I'm going to find out. So, you raise a great question. I guess maybe the long and short of it is frequently, biblical texts are literary creations. They don't always give us, you can ask great questions about characters that frequently the biblical writer isn't interested in that issue. I think the strongest reason for not seeing it as a rape is in the very next chapter we do have a rape. Which actually is a rape that is somewhat, culpable for, of Tamar. And there, a biblical author is quite clear of the circumstances of the rape and has no compunction about describing it in considerable detail. So if it was a rape here, I think that would be kind of peculiar. It's not given that color.
Dr. Anderson, thank you so much. I would stand up, but I won't give you some. Thank you so much for this conversation that is complicating a lot of the categories we have for forgiveness, and I think giving us some helpful vocabulary. And my question is kind of on the last point you just brought up with the rape of Tamar. And I wonder if you could explain or help us square some of David's punishment that includes the harm of his children, and that as being the source of his humiliation, leading also to his elevation. Can you help us understand that context and how to handle passages or even situations of forgiveness where there is irreparable harm or there is more harm kind of included in someone's eventual satisfaction?
So I'm not sure I've grasped your question, so I'll start to answer it, and I'm going to stop and make sure I've captured what you want to ask. One of the things that's very interesting when we turn, this would be like a second lecture, give of course a lot of pieces to this, what in short 1 hour can't do everything. But one of the remarkable features of the very next chapter, which is the story of Amnon's rape of Tamar, is David's failure to rebuke Amnon for his actions. And that, of course, raises the ire of Absalom, and that's what leads to Absalom's then murder of Amnon for that, horrendous action. And then Absalom has to, I assume you know the story, he has to go into exile, and then he's, kind of persona non grata to David, which sets up, eventually his rebellion. So the way we have to understand this is frequent in the Bible, is through the, the principle of double causation. So Nathan says in chapter 12 that this measure for measure punishment is going to proceed. And Absalom implied he's going to revolt against him, as though God were the sole actor. When we turn to the next chapter, we see, oh my God, well, this rebellion would have happened irrespective of what Nathan said. In other words, David has set up the circumstances for the rebellion himself, right? And by a different set of actions on his behalf, because again, he's very much like Jacob in Genesis. He doesn't exercise the role of pater familias. He doesn't, he doesn't reprimand his sons when they should be reprimanded. Or like Jacob in chapter 37, he doesn't see the tremendous hatred that's brewing for Joseph right in front of his eyes. So Jacob is very much culpable for what happens to Joseph in that chapter, for not being, a attuned and sensitive father, and David himself. And in light of his indiscretion vis-a-vis Amnon's actions, invites upon himself. So I think we can see then that yes, the punishment of the revolt is, and the kind of primary cause is that of God, and as a result of his sin of Bathsheba, but God isn't like, using puppets on a marionette to make this happen. David is actually of his own free will. And that's again like the Joseph story. What's the amazing thing at the end of the Joseph story when Joseph tells his brothers that he's not going to take vengeance because he says, God sent me here. Well, God didn't send him there. The brothers sent him there. There's no, in fact, the Joseph story is remarkable, and many scholars have noticed this, because there's no record of divine agency in the story. Everything proceeds on the basis of what the human agents themselves do, which is very different than earlier in Genesis, where God is always intervening in a dream, in a vision, telling the patriarchs what to do. There's none of that in the Joseph story. But everything depends on the Joseph story. At the end, Joseph's saying, well, God arranged all of this. Well, God arranged all of this through secondary causes, right? And so, yes, it's providence at work, but it's not providence that comes at the expense of human agency, right? And so, ironically, in Genesis, the brothers secure their salvation from famine in Egypt by attempting to kill Joseph. Think about that. That's like a Felix culpa, right? But that doesn't, because what they do is in accord somehow with providence, doesn't make them innocent of the sin. Right? They're going to be punished for advancing a providential goal. And I think we have to, when we take a look at the way these punishments unfold for David, it's the same thing. It's not God, as it were, having all of these characters, at the end of strings, making them do all of this, again, like there's some kind of karmic principle of justice at play. But these actors are all acting out of their own free agency, but in God's providential wisdom is all to the effect of, eventually the restoration of David's person. Did I catch your question?
Yeah, that's helpful.
And with that, I think we'll leave things there. Can you join me in giving Dr.